afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone listening, wherever you're listening. I am Jam, and you're listening to the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, a podcast dedicated to spreading mental health awareness as a means to help us all heal. You, me, my guests, let's just all heal together. Speaking of guests, my guest today happens to be someone who I know very well. He is a former coworker and in many respects, he's a friend. His name is Patches Chance, a writer and interview specialist whose work you can find over at Daily DDT, Dork Side of the Force, and Bell to Bells. Some of those names you may have heard in previous episodes, but trust me, the information that he gives during our discussion is exclusive and, of course, priceless. Patches personally asked me to come on the podcast, and he uses his platform to share some not only valuable information but deeply personal part of himself that I commend him for sharing. And with that said, I must provide a trigger warning as the conversation that follows does reference sexual assault, so if that's not something that you'd like to hear about, I suggest skipping this episode. Otherwise, I'd like to just dive straight into this conversation, but first, remember when you're done listening, I recommend following him at Patches Chance on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you have any feedback for the podcast during this humble beginning stage with its 6 episodes so far, feel free to email me at mentalhealthcheckinpod@gmail.com or message us on social media. Now, on to the show. Welcome back to the Mental Health Check-In Podcast. My next guest is a fantastic journalist, interviewer, and former co-worker, former co-editor, just all-around great guy. This is Patches Chance. How you doing, Patches?
Good. What's up?
Doing good. Well, like I said, like we're former co-workers. It's been a while since we worked there. First, we were just editing together. Then I
Yeah.
was the editor and you were the writer. Now you're the writer and I'm not even there anymore. And oh yeah, and there being Daily DDT, of course, in case anybody was
Yeah.
wondering.
That's where we
Yeah.
were.
And I've been gone for like 2, maybe 3 months. So, what's changed since then with you?
I mean, time flies. It's been. I mean, obviously, everything's been crazy with COVID and everything. The world's going crazy.
Mm-hmm.
As far as writing, I've continued to work, doing interviews here and there. I'm actually working on a couple I'm really excited right now. One with the people who do Uncanny Attractions, and one with a bunch of people involved with Paris is Bumping. So I'm excited for those to come soon.
Paris Bumper looks really exciting.
Yeah, it
And
does.
for people now, where Uncanny Attractions is a wrestling promotion, Paris is Bumping is it's supposed to be like an event, right? Or is it an actual like another wrestling promotion?
It's going to be an event that's a combination ballroom and wrestling event. Going into this, I binged a lot of ballroom content to
Hmm.
get ready for this, and so like I went through and watched Legendary on HBO Max, and I intended to just watch a couple episodes to get an idea of it,
Hmm.
and then I couldn't stop, and I watched every single episode, and just about every single one was tear-inducing. It's such a powerful show. It's HBO Max.
Okay.
It's Legendary. It's basically a competition show for ballroom. So there's 8 different houses of like traditional ballroom houses with 5 competitors representing each, and so it's a competition show, but it's very personal because it delves into a lot of their personal stories and stuff that they've had to deal with. A lot of them um, growing up, either as trans or as queer, and everything that they've kind of had to deal with, and a lot of people of color on the show, and so understandably a lot of difficult things that they've had to deal with, some of whom have had very supportive parents, some of whom have not had very supportive parents.
Staying on like everything that you've been doing with the pandemic, with protests, with everything going on right now. I'm just kind of curious, like, what are you doing right now to just make you happy, keep you sane doing all this?
Um, a lot of just trying to. Part of it is working. I'm not unfortunately working full time right now. I'm just doing writing and journalism, and I've been diving more into that lately, which helps because it's a distraction and it helps me feel like I'm productive and busy. And it's work that I'm very, excited to do, and work that I feel is very important. And so that really helps at a time like this. Also, a lot of just entertaining content as I can, watching movies, binging TV shows and documentaries, playing games as I can, just all that kind of stuff. Stuff that I usually use to try and distract myself from the chaos going on in the world, and it's still working. So,
Okay, I'm glad you're doing that, especially like with the whole outlet of interviewing and writing. Because from what I've seen just on the timeline, you've been doing a lot of cool stuff. Like you interviewed MVyun, this independent wrestler, a while back, or
yeah,
recently, I should say. That was really
yeah,
cool.
that was a big one.
Hmm.
I was very happy with that. The timing ended up interesting because we
Hmm.
we had initially talked prior to, I believe it was back in May. So we were kind of, it was, coronavirus was happening and it was impacting the wrestling community, and we were talking about mental health as well, and the ways that mental health can be affected by this pandemic and how it's affecting wrestlers and stuff like that. And then while I was working on it, the protests and it being Pride Month, and he was heavily involved in protests in New York City, including collecting donations to basically take bulk amounts of water and Gatorade out to protests to pass out for free to protesters. Because he talked about basically he had seen people, passing out from heat stroke and heat exhaustion and dehydration, and that was a way he could help and give back. And then also physically placing himself in front of, protesters of color on the front line to protect them from police, because generally when a you know masculine looking white guy steps in front of them and that's who police are staring down, they tend to back down. Not always, but it's pretty likely.
Yeah, very likely, unfortunately.
But and it's been interesting to watch for me because I have a history in law enforcement. I was a police dispatcher for about 5 years, and the time I was there, it was a job that I took seriously, and did I think I did very well. But the longer I was there, the more it became clear to me just how many systemic issues there were in law enforcement. And having to see that and be entrenched in law enforcement culture on a daily basis was having a huge negative effect on my mental health, as I was realizing that almost no one I worked with agreed with me on, you know, basic fundamental things like, having humanity for other people and stuff like that. And so it got to the point where I just had to leave. Um, and it's been kind of a roller coaster since then. I've took a couple months off, basically stayed at my parents', or at my dad's house. That did not end well. He did not take any of my mental health struggles seriously, and did a lot of "it's in your head" and "just get over it" and that kind of rhetoric. Um, Ultimately, I ended up with a screaming match with him, where I called him out for a lot of racism and bigotry on his end. And his response was basically to call me a race traitor and tell me to go ask the Black Panthers for help. So I got my stuff and left my dad's and haven't really talked to him since. Um, Stayed with my aunt in Louisiana for a little while, ended up spending about 8 months in New York, and then now I'm back in Texas. And it's been a roller coaster. It's, mentally, there's been up and down times during it, but I'm in a much better place, even with the struggles I'm still dealing with now, than I have been. And so, even in a difficult employment situation, and while I'm trying to work on my writing and other things, um, I'm not having things bearing down on me the way I had kind of let them over the years, and that's made a big difference.
I'm really sorry you had to go through that.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that things are at least looking up a little bit. But like I feel like I feel obligated to ask just like, are you okay mentally right now? Like you said, it was like a roller coaster, and just out of general concern, I want to know how you're doing.
I'm doing okay. I still have rough days, but I'm, on a scale I would generally put myself between a 5 and a 7, like a 10 being, my best mental health day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, considering I definitely had days closer to 2 and 3 in the last couple of years, you know, hovering between a 5 and a 7 is an improvement, for sure.
Do you have any advice for people who feel like they're also in between a 5 and a 7, or maybe lower, but don't know how to lift themselves up a little bit?
It's the first thing is that just remember that you're not the only one going through this. I mean, a lot more people are going through this that don't want to acknowledge it. For a lot of years, I struggled with anxiety and depression and never really acknowledged it to myself. It wasn't until about, God, it would have been, I don't know, probably 5-6 years ago when I was in my early 20s that I really started kind of facing things. Tried antidepressants for the first time, and medication is important. And for a lot of people, it can be a life-saving difference. Once I got on something that was kind of the right mix for me, it did help. Over time, sometimes if you're on something, even if it's working, it will just stop working. Your body builds up a resistance to it. You know, the chemical imbalance changes. Something happens that makes it just not be as effective as it has been. My medication got to a point where it was like that. It just wasn't having the helpful effect that it needed to. And so I'm actually off medication at the moment, partly because it hadn't been helping and partly because I don't have insurance and I'm unemployed basically. So there's the one side of just being able to afford it, but also even if I could afford it, I would really need to go see a psych right now to get on a different mix. And that's something I can't even come close to afford without insurance.
I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope things just get better at least for you.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that things are at least getting better in some ways, but I just hope things get even better. Because just knowing you as just a friend, man, just you work really hard. You worked really hard when I was at Daily DDT, and you deserve to be happy. I guess what I'm trying to say.
Thanks. Another thing that has been a help for me in the past that, you know, when I can afford it again, I'll probably start doing again is therapy. Um, Unfortunately, it's not as accessible as it really needs to be for a lot of people. But if you can afford it, it's makes such a big difference. The other big thing I would say for therapy, if people have thought about it and maybe they've tried it and it didn't go right, try a different therapist. Because the first time I tried therapy and had a therapist who was, you know, she was fine, but she was older and just the personalities didn't mesh. I didn't feel comfortable opening up. It just didn't feel right. It wasn't the right fit. And it kind of made me go, well, maybe this isn't for me. And then about a year and a half later, I had, you know, decided to give it a shot again and went looking and found a different therapist who was not super young, but closer to my age, was in her 30s. Uh, and timing wise, it worked out. I'd just gone through kind of a rough thing. And so the first time I saw her, I was at a really low point, and wasn't really able to keep my walls up the first time I saw that therapist, which made me just completely break down in front of her. And that ended up actually being a good thing because I immediately felt comfortable doing that, and felt safe in that situation. And so, you know, if you try it, if you're able to afford it, it can be a huge difference. And if you try it and it doesn't work out, you know, give it some time. But if it just doesn't feel like the right fit, don't keep pushing. Just try a different therapist. You know, find someone who fits your needs. You know, there's not just one. There's plenty. Especially in a time like this when everything's digital. So I mean, you're going to be having digital appointments anyways. You don't have to stick to the ones you can drive to.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo that a little bit. Like I've learned that finding a therapist is very much like trial and error type of thing. You may not be totally, I guess, comfortable with your first therapist. So
Mm-hmm.
you just have to keep digging and you have to ask yourself, well, what do I need in a therapist? What needs specifically about me do I need catered to basically? Like, do I
Yeah.
need someone who can relate to me in age? Do I need someone who needs to relate to my experiences with my race, experiences with my sexuality? It's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different factors you have to look into, and it might take a couple therapists. You might get lucky and get your first therapist that's perfect, but for if you're not so lucky, you just need to keep looking and don't stop giving up.
Yeah. And I know it varies a lot from place to place, and depending on, what's going to be accessible right now is probably going to be a little different than what's normally accessible. But in general, I know that a lot of schools will often have students that are psychiatry students or something like that, or psychology students, that sometimes they will have to do sessions as part of their program. Sometimes you can get access to those sessions for a lot cheaper. And I think like the conventional wisdom might be to think that it's not going to be as helpful because it's someone who doesn't have the same amount of experience. But the biggest benefit of therapy is just having someone completely disconnected from you that you feel safe to just unload on freely and talk things out with. And they don't need 35 years of experience to be able to listen. And there's a possibility, everyone's experience is different, but there's a possibility, if that's something that's, possible in your area and might be a more affordable option, that could still have a huge positive impact.
100%. And we did mention, well, you mentioned that a lot of therapy these days is going to be online, like Skype video calls. How different is that experience from being in person? And is it more difficult to open up on video call than in person?
I think I've only done it once. I've done a couple of phone sessions with my old therapist. Um, the video one I did was frustrating, but it wasn't actually because of it being video. It was because the apps that they were using broke up a lot. And so a lot of times I'd be talking to her and have an entire sentence glitch out of what she was saying back to me. And so it almost felt like a challenge, like I was trying to fill in the blanks as I was talking to her. And the technical difficulties did make the session a little more difficult. But when I've done them all over the phone, it's different. But especially if you've already built a rapport with someone, it can make a big difference. If you're building that rapport now, I would guess video might be a little easier than audio, just because you can see who you're interacting with, and it feels a little closer to personal. But even then, I think at its most base, the benefit of therapy is being able to safely vent to a third party. And even if you're on audio or video and you're not in the same room as someone, you're still getting that benefit. And so it's different and it's not exactly the same, but I think you can still get a lot of positive out of it.
I agree with that. Like, even if you're in a video call, audio, in person, the importance is just the space you're in, even if the person you're talking to is miles away. As long as you're in a space that you consider safe, if I feel safe just in the comfort of my home or in a therapy office,
Mm-hmm.
that's the important part, because in a safe space, then I can create dialogue. Then when dialogue's created, I can dig into what things I need to work on in myself.
Yeah, and I would add to that if, don't be hesitant to go to a different spot than maybe like your room if you
Mhm.
are in a living situation where you may not feel comfortable talking about difficult things that maybe your roommates or family might overhear. If you're old enough to have a vehicle or you're in a position to have a vehicle, go sit in your car. If you need to go, the park's probably not going to have as many people there right now as it normally would. If you feel safe to do that, get in some place, if at all possible, find some place that is somewhere you feel safe saying anything you possibly want, so that you can have that fully free and open conversation once you're ready.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't even think about that. Like, if you're in a living situation, be it with family, roommates, however, you may not necessarily be in a space where you feel comfortable talking and you're afraid that someone's going to overhear you. Definitely transition to a place where you do feel safe, be it a car, be it the park or anything like that. And then just when you have that space, just completely unload as if you were in a therapy office or if you were in the comfort of your own room.
Yeah, for sure.
I was curious, how did your mental health journey, so to speak, begin? Because you said that you didn't start like looking inward earlier until like your early 20s. If
Mhm.
we don't have to get into like anything too personal, but I'm just curious, like what made you decide I need to start focusing on what's in my head?
Um, it's a little difficult to pinpoint. I know now that I've struggled with levels of anxiety and depression for a lot of years. It to get a little personal, the big thing that impacted me when I was younger is I lost my mom when I was 17. It was the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. Um, and I definitely grieved very, in a very real and, helpful way at the time. But there were, still parts of that I needed to unpack over time. And it was when I was working law enforcement and I was, having a lot of different struggles with depression and anxiety and realizing I was becoming more insular. And I'm kind of a naturally introverted person, anyways, but it was getting to the point where I didn't want to go anywhere. I would go to work, I would come home, I would stay there. Um, if friends wanted to get me to drive, you know, just outside of town to go to lunch or something, I would generally be like, yeah, no, come to my house. I feel safe here. Like I wouldn't say that, but that's what I was feeling in my head and inside is that I didn't really want to go anywhere else. I was kind of searching for some sort of control. Um, and just while I was there, I don't remember what the initial catalyst was for trying it, but one of the ideas, I got this idea from a John Mulaney comedy special. Um, he had talked about a time that he was looking to get, I think, Xanax or something, and it was a comedy bit where he's talking about basically a friend had told him, just go to the doctor and say sometimes you get nervous on airplanes, and they might give you some Xanax or something, for as needed in that situation. And he had, made this doctor's visit on some other pretense, which goes comically wrong for him. But the idea of making a doctor's visit on some other pretense and then waiting till you get there and being like, also, I want to talk about this. That was kind of my catalyst. And so I just made like a general checkup doctor's visit and waited till I got into the doctor's office and I was talking to the doctor. And then finally went, also, sometimes I struggle with depression and I've thought about trying medication. And he was completely open to it. It didn't, I had built that moment up in my head in a way that made me very kind of worried about trying it, which some of that I'm sure came from the fact that some of these were things that my mom struggled with over the years. And I know she had been on antidepressants at different times and stuff like that. And so I'm sure there was kind of some undercurrent of worry about that. Um, Once I went and talked to him, I just, brought it up. And the doctor was this kind of chill old man in his 70s who had the funniest reaction to me. And he was pretty open about it. And he's like, yeah, so we'll try Zoloft. That's my favorite antidepressant. Like, your favorite? What are you talking about? And but I mean, he tried it, and so we started on it. I will also throw out for medication. Beware that medication sucks at first a lot of times, because there's a lot of times you will have initial side effects that will not happen once your body is adjusted. So both times I've tried, pretty much every time I've tried medication, I've had initial side effects that went away. With Wellbutrin, which is one that I tried later, and then initially Zoloft. Both times I had severe digestive issues. When I tried Wellbutrin at a later time, I ended up having like pretty severe vomiting for the first couple days. Um, you know, make sure to talk to your doctor depending on how the situation is going, but there's a possibility that you may deal with those for a few days and then have them just disappear completely. And that's something that, in my experience, happened. Is I would have, these onset side effects as your body's adjusting to the medication and adjusting to the chemicals. And then, after a couple days, it will lessen. After a couple weeks, it'll be gone entirely. I also had, sometimes odd side effects, like when I first started Zoloft, I discovered that one of the side effects of Zoloft can be excessive yawning.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, neither did I. I was just realizing that I was yawning way too much. Like, not even when I was tired. And I mean, I was in a situation to be kind of tired often, but I was yawning way more than normal and way more frequently. And I finally went, that's weird. I should Google that, and found some examples of people who had started Zoloft and had experienced kind of excessive yawning. And it can be an issue for a little while, and then it goes away. And, once my body had adjusted to the medication, it wasn't really an issue. I yawned about as much as I ever did. But at first, it was just one of those little things where I'm like, where did this come from? I wasn't doing this 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. Like when you first start a medication, there's gonna be side effects you're not used to or not aware of. First off, it's worth looking into the side effects before you start taking it, just so you know what you're getting into. And if not, just contact your doctor as soon as these side effects start arising. And in some cases, the side effects may be extreme enough where you may need to switch medications. But in other cases, is if you just have to try to, as long as it's nothing like excessive yawning, like if you can push forward, then you can really get the benefits of what you get the medication for.
Yeah, and another important thing I think people need to remember about medication is it can be really helpful, but it's also the feeling is it's not going to be like you're on ecstasy every day or something. It's not that drastic. It basically what medication can do is kind of raise your floor. So if, you feel like you normally dunk down to a 2 or a 1, or like maybe you're in a really tough spot and sometimes it's like a -4 or something ridiculous, the medication is not going to bring you up to a 9 all the time, but it's going to raise the floor so that your dips are not as low. So that when you have rough days, it's going to be, I kind of feel like crap. It's not going to be, you're not going to, hopefully, if the medication is working properly, because I mean, anything can, you know, people can try any medication and have it not go really as intended. But if things are working like intended and you find the right mix, then it can mean that those low days, you just have a crappy day and not get, into a severe thought spiral, or even worse, get suicidal or something like that. It can kind of help you stay level.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I just want to say that I really admire the fact that you were not only able to recognize when you needed help, needed medications at an early time in your 20s, but just to get the courage to even approach that feeling with your doctor, because that's really important. It's only like recently in the last couple months where I've really decided that I need to look inward and just
Yeah.
recognize certain things that I am going through certain traumas and certain anxieties and certain triggers. And for people listening, I also think it's important to, when you notice certain things in yourself and you really start to try look inward, it's important to actually use actual terms like trauma and anxiety and triggers. And a lot of the things I've learned by myself are things I've noticed before, but I never realized how serious it was until I identified it as a trigger, as trauma, as
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. Identifying the problem as these certain terms, that goes a long way in your mental health journey.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that it's never too late to even start your mental health journey. Like you said, you were in your early 20s. I'm 24, going to be 25 next month. I'm only just starting now to get into
Mm-hmm.
it. So like you're never too young, never too old to really work on yourself is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, everybody's journey is different, and everybody, comes to these situations from a different angle and with different traumas and struggles. And yeah, identifying what they are and calling them what they are, it it removes power from them. It takes power away from those things to kind of sit and fester inside of you. There's been, things I've struggled with over the years. There was um, a situation that I actually had to deal. It wasn't something I dealt with recently, but it was something I realized recently. Essentially, there had been a situation where I had been basically sexually harassed and uh, sexually assaulted in a workplace about 8, 9 years ago now. And it was someone who basically he had, constantly been making inappropriate comments towards me. And eventually it got to the point where I kind of caved and let him kind of feel me up while we were the only ones at work. And it was something that, I had kept in touch with him, not really processing what had actually happened to me back then. And we had actually been talking again and even talking about potentially starting a relationship, which was a new thing for me. I'm, openly bisexual now, but uh, hadn't been in a relationship with, in a same-sex relationship up till that point. And I was noticing red flags with him and noticing issues with the situation. And I kind of just vented to a friend one night and sent her kind of a long text explaining, like, hey, I just need advice. This is what's going on. These are things that happened. And she just kind of called it out and was like, you were sexually assaulted. And at first my brain was like, no, you weren't. I was like, no, oh no, I was. And that's not an uncommon thing for, people who have had these experiences, both women and men, to, you kind of rationalize it in your head. And by not calling it what it is and by not, facing it, it can kind of fester in the back of your mind and gain power and convince you that, it was something that wasn't a big deal, or maybe you did something wrong and that's why it happened, or something like that. And once as tough as it is, once you face it and confront what happened, you remove power from it, and it makes it much more manageable to move forward. And also remove, if there was someone involved in that situation that you still have contact with, remove them from your situation and cut off contact if at all possible. Because that was something that I did after I talked to my friend about it and kind of faced what had happened. I, confided in a couple of friends about it, and then completely cut off contact. And that's made a huge difference. I mean, there was really tough times in the immediate aftermath as I was trying to process everything, but I know that it was good to face and process, and now I'm doing better having dealt with that and moved forward from it.
Absolutely. First off, I would just want to say I'm sorry you had to go through that situation. That is a horrible, horrible thing. I'm glad you've cut that person out of your life completely. Two, to piggyback off what you said, I feel like that in addition to just calling terms what they are, calling is what is, by identifying these problems as such, not only do you no longer give them power, you're also able to take the steps to gain control over them. I hope I'm wording that correctly. By that I mean you're able to then take the steps to say, okay, this is an issue I'm dealing with. Now I can take the steps to educate myself and figure out how I heal from the situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's correct that it's once you understand what happened and kind of can compartmentalize stuff in a way that you can really look at it and know this is what's happening and this is what I'm dealing with, you can then start looking for remedies and looking for ways to cope and ways to process and move forward. Whether that's, that could be something you do with a therapist, and through therapy, if you're not in the situation to do that, that's something you can do yourself as you try and, do research. That's one thing that I think it's important because there's always a risk with misdiagnosis. Not everybody is a professional, not everybody is a doctor, but especially, in a country where having access to medical care is, and especially mental health care, is not the norm. A lot of people that struggle with mental health issues basically have to become experts on their own struggles. And it's bullshit. It shouldn't be the case, but that's the way it works sometimes. And so, do research and try and understand these things. And if you're coming up against something and you're seeing, signs that maybe this is what I could be going through, maybe this is something I could be dealing with, obviously you're not, taking the step of assigning yourself medication, but you can confront those things yourselves. And if you have a friend to confide in and someone you feel safe talking to, you can talk to them about it. Say, hey, this is, what I've been going through, and this is kind of what I'm seeing. Does that make sense to you? I remember even when I got to the point where I was willing to, kind of admit that I was dealing with depression and anxiety. And I brought it up to a longtime friend of mine, who I've known for years and years and years since I was. We joke that we've known each other since we were -1 because our moms knew each other when they were pregnant with us. So, I mean, we've known each other forever, and we're really good friends still. And I went to get food with him not long after I had that realization and talked to a doctor about it and brought it up to him. I was like, so I, recently realized I've, been struggling with depression for a long time. And he looked at me and went, yeah. I was like, oh, you knew? Why don't you tell me? But as a friend, I mean, it's difficult to confront that with somebody who isn't ready to face it themselves. And so, I don't hold any ill will towards him for not bringing it up to me or anything like that. But, once I was ready to face it and I mentioned it to him, he, validated that was something he could see. He could see some of the things I was struggling with, and he could see, some of the ways that I was closing in on myself and, just not connecting like I needed to be.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about, the importance of talking to a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or just a friend. Just like you need someone to validate what you're going through. Like you can't just keep it all on your, even if you're coming to like certain conclusions and educating yourself, you need that second party to tell you, okay, what you're saying does make sense, or you're on the right track, but I think that you're actually XYZ, such and
Right.
such. And it's, again, just to echo it to all the listeners, yes, it's important to just talk to someone about what you're going through before it festers too hard in your head.
Yeah, and whether it's talking to a friend or talking to a psychiatrist or a therapist, um, sometimes even just saying it out loud, even if you're not getting exactly necessarily what you need from them, just reiterating it and trying to explain it can kind of help you realize what you're going through. And so just having, even if you just got a friend who's willing to listen, that can still make a big difference.
Absolutely. And when you say moving forward, that actually reminds me to pivot a little bit. There was a quote that I always saw on your social media and your website. With luck, forward. The quote from Patton Oswalt. So I was kind of curious if you could elaborate what that quote means to you and why it's so important to you.
Yeah, so that quote is actually one that I kind of clung to. So timing wise, I watched Ratatouille. So I've seen Ratatouille many times. It's a movie I enjoy. It's a great movie. And Patton Oswalt plays Remy in Ratatouille. I watched that movie a few days before I left my dad's, and a few days before I had the big blow up with him. And in the movie, there's a scene where Remy is arguing with his dad, and Remy is wanting to kind of go do something and kind of do his own thing, and his dad's kind of trying to hold him to the family and make him do what his dad wants him to do. And Remy just kind of gets fed up and leaves. And as he's walking away, his dad yells at him, "Where are you going?" And Remy turns back and says, "With luck, forward." And that was something that kind of really hit me. And then, of course, a couple days later, things kind of blew up, and I ended up just taking what I could fit in my car and leaving. And kind of had that feeling. It's like, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what's next. I don't know what's happening. But with luck, I'm moving forward. And I actually, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but that
Nice.
is a tattoo I have on my arm that is Remy from Ratatouille, and around it, it's a portrait, and around it, it says "With luck, forward." I actually got that last year when I was staying in Louisiana with my aunt, and it was something a lot of my tattoos have meaning, and that's one that I was really feeling the power of that quote and what it meant to me. And it's just an important thing that, sometimes we're not going to know where we're headed. I've, especially in the last couple of years, been in situations where I really didn't know what was happening. I am still kind of baffled by the fact that I was able to spend 8 months in New York. That experience was difficult. I spent 8 months in New York looking for a job and got nothing. Sent out I don't know how many applications and got just no response from a lot of them, and had a tough time. But I also got to chill in New York, like in New York City, like 4 blocks from Columbia University, near Harlem, and all these amazing places, for 8 months, and roam around sometimes. And I didn't check out a lot of like touristy places. I kind of just wanted to experience the city. And so there were a couple times I just would go hop on a bus and roam and just let myself kind of roam around the city. One of the things that actually helped me notice some landmarks while I was there was, of all things, Pokemon Go. So I used Pokemon Go both on the trip up there and once I was there. So the way I actually got to New York, I did not fly there. I took a train. I took a 32-hour train ride from New Orleans direct to Penn Station in New York. It was that was an interesting experience. And it was something that, I got to, sit at the window and watch American countryside roll by me for 30 plus hours. I got to eat the worst seasoned chicken breast I've ever had in my entire life, on their dining car. It was truly terrible. The waiter was nice though, so I still tipped because it's not their fault the food's terrible. Because it was very clearly like prepackaged, like microwave stuff that they just like heated up. And I was like, it's not your fault. This is terrible. This is just badly made food. But while I was on the train, we would stop at stations as we were going, and I would kind of keep my phone out and pull up Pokemon Go. And even if we were going too fast for me to actually, if you've played the game, if you're going at a certain speed, it won't let you interact with things. But you can still have the map open and watch things fly by. And so you can see something on the map and pull it up. And if it's a Pokestop, it'll say what it is. Sometimes it's something plain like a Starbucks. But sometimes it's like a historical landmark or something like that. And so like there was one, we passed by a place called Saugus Ironworks, which was an ironworking factory that I ended up looking up. And it was a powerful thing to think about because it was not just an ironworking factory from the turn of the century, but this is a place that now there's like a museum there. They also do ghost tours. Part of the reason for that is because post the abolition of slavery, this was in the South, and there were situations where basically they were taking, people of color and black people and putting them in indentured servitude, as far as, arresting them, forcing them to work, basically finding out a way to recreate slavery without it being slavery. And a lot of them were given the worst and most dangerous jobs in this ironworking factory that really probably the entire town's economy and the entire town was built on this work, where all these people, all these probably people who had been freed slaves are then in a terrible situation again and given these dangerous jobs, and a lot of them died in the factories. That's such a little thing, but I found that out because of Pokemon Go. Because I was playing on my phone on the way, and I would wait for these things to pass by, and then I'd look it up and go, but what is this? Why is this thing here? It looked very interesting. From like as passing by, it was a very interesting like landmark to look at. It was this old 1900 ironworking factory. And it's the same thing once I got to New York. I would get on the bus and just let it kind of take me down the route, and there would be murals and all these interesting things, and like churches that have been there for over 100, 200 years. and all these things, understanding the history of that place, both good and very bad, and facing that. And so even though while I was there, I didn't, get the job I wanted, it didn't work out exactly like I intended, that's an experience I'll never, lose. That's an experience that I'll never forget. And that's a level of immersion and learning that was important. And no, I did not expect to spend 8 months there and then have to leave and go stay with some friends in Texas. I did not expect the first place I stayed in Texas to go a little poorly and to have some issues with my roommates, and then end up having to leave there and end up with an old friend that's basically family at this point. But that's the way the cards fell. And even though these things went in a way that I would never have expected, I do feel like as a person and mentally, I'm moving forward. Even though the directions that I've taken have not been what I guessed. And, no, I did not expect to be a semi-unemployed wrestling journalist at 28, coming on 29. But I'm here. I've had a really interesting road to get here, and I'm ready to keep rolling in whatever direction forward is.
And I'm really happy for you because I do remember those times when you were telling me that you were in New York and moving to New York, and without delving too much into it, I know you had a tough time in there and you had a lot of hardships over there, but to see where you're at now, I can already tell just from talking to you and seeing you that you seem to be in a much better place. So
Yeah.
that that phrase with luck forward, you've definitely gone forward, and I really love the meaning behind that line. That might be a really good place to end the podcast. But before we end it, I just want to ask, are there any goals you have right now or things, positive things that you want to manifest for yourself right now?
Really, I mean, like, as I said, kind of just moving forward, and continuing to do that, however that plays out. As far as, stuff I've got working on, as I mentioned, I've got those 2 interviews coming up. I've already spoken to some of the people involved. So, transcribing those and putting those together, those are important pieces about, yeah, it's about wrestling, but these are important shows that are spotlighting marginalized voices and really lifting people up who need to be lifted up. And so I'm very proud to get the opportunity to help that in any way I can.
And I'm very proud of you and where you are right now. And one more thing before we go. First off, thank you for coming on the podcast. But I have this segment with all my guests where I try to give people their flowers, so to speak. Let my guests know they're appreciated in case we never speak again for whatever reason. And I appreciate you just for being so helpful in like my time as an editor. Like you were at Daily DDT before I was, you ed before I was, and you were very welcoming and very open to just showing me the ropes. And I know for a fact I may not have been easy to deal with all times. I may have been just so inexperienced. I was just doing the wrong thing, or I was just annoying. And I apologize if I was. I'm sure I was, but you were always patient with me, even if I wasn't patient with myself. And I always remember that and appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that we still have this relationship with each other long after I've even left Daily DDT. You've been a good friend, and I'll admit I'm bad at keeping in touch with everyone, really. So we haven't probably talked as much as I would like, but I appreciate you as just friend, confidant, co-worker, former co-worker, however you want to call it, and just I appreciate you just for being you, man. You are just hearing your story. It's very inspiring. I hope people listening get inspired from it, and I hope nothing but the best for you in your career and life journey. And you're doing such great things in the wrestling world, and I'm so happy and excited for you. And I hope things get even better from here. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And one more thing, just thank you for even asking to come on, because you're just the second person who's even asked to come on. So like me just doing this new thing, I appreciate that, man.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on.